Alright, gang, here we go. Here's a quick discussion on the perspective grid in Illustrator. Quick thing, when making a new file, I think for this round, especially because we're dealing with the perspective grid, I would recommend going ahead and making it a tabloid size document at least. You can go bigger if you want, heck, I can even type in some measurements. Let's do a 20-inch by 20-inch square just for kicks. And otherwise, all the default CMYK, 300 ppi, all that is fine. We'll hit OK. Alright, so the big discussion is, and I know we talked briefly about it in class, but Illustrator doing 3D, well, not actually. It does, but not in the sense like what you may have seen in programs like Google SketchUp or 3D Max or any of those kind of programs, of those software items that are out there. What Illustrator does is sort of a faux 3D. Like we can create objects and they feel very three-dimensional, but once they're actually created in an Illustrator document, you can't really grab it and rotate it and spin it and keep changing light sources, for the most part, with any of the stuff in this realm, especially with the perspective grid that we're going to talk about. So, the perspective grid, you can always bring it visible by going under the View menu, go down literally to the perspective grid option, and then there's Show Grid. Or for those that like the little quick key option, it's Command+Shift+I. And then you see this guy. Now, granted, it also responds to how close or far away we are from it. So right now, the whole artboard fits on my screen, but if I start to zoom in, you'll start to see more of the grid show up. So as we zoom in, you see it gets a little bigger, a little wider on both sides. And so it's, again, part of that faux 3D aspect. When we zoom out, it shrinks down in how much grid it actually shows. So don't be surprised if it looks a little different on your screen than mine. That's okay. But yeah, here's the 3D grid. Here's the other crux of their 3D grid system. And this is the 2-point perspective. We have 1 point over here, 1 point over here. So a lot of that same discussion verbiage that you encountered way back in the foundational 2D studio or 2D digital maybe, and the drawing studio itself. So you may have discussed a little bit of this, but here it is. So we've got the grid live. The main thing to focus in on is, sorry, I had to change this back real quick. You'll notice in your tools menu, you should see a little icon that almost looks like a perspective of 3 windows in a row, and they're casting sunlight into this room. And if you let the mouse just rest on it, it should say Perspective Grid Tool. Hey! So as long as this is selected, you'll notice on the grid itself, a lot of these pieces suddenly become very active. You can see all these anchor points that are on the actual grid itself. You can draw and pull and change scale and size. But the main thing to remember is that you probably don't want to futz with it too much for all intents and purposes of what we're doing with creating either packaging or bags or any sort of thing. The main elements you might play with is on either side of the top horizontal line. You can actually click and hold on your trackpad or mouse and pull up or down to change how high up or how low that perspective might be. And you can start to see right away with the way that the blue and orange sides of this perspective grid change. You could easily start to envision what might be an office building versus a package versus a really skinny package, but you've got some items to play with there. The other thing to watch out, the bottom corner anchor points, this one on the left side and this one over here on the right. If you click and hold that, you actually move the whole entire grid. Here's the other crux of the situation. It doesn't matter how many artboards you have in an AI file, you only get one perspective grid. So we could take this grid and move it entirely off this artboard onto another one if you want, but per file you only get one grid. So the challenge is if you happen to, let's say if I had a second artboard, if I drew a bunch of stuff using the perspective grid on this artboard, and then I move this grid to another artboard, I've effectively separated all the artwork from this first round from it. So make sure you never move this grid unless you absolutely have to, because once you move it, if you have artwork that's on it, it's all popped off of the grid, and if you try to change it after that, it won't handle the perspective changes. which we'll see more in a second. So, easy peasy, we got one grid. There's basically three sides to it: the blue side, the orange side, and this green grid side that's essentially like the floor. There is some different perspectives we can play with. If you go back under that same view menu and down to the perspective grid, by default, Illustrator wants to show the 2-point perspective, this view down here. We could switch to a 1-point perspective. So if you go to 1 point, select 1 point normal view, there we have the 1-point perspective grid. We can always go back now and even switch to the 3-point perspective, which will give us more almost like this rooftop feel. You can kind of see right away, if I move this up into the space, now it's like the floor is the top floor, the green layer, and the blue and the orange are coming down respectively for that third point of view perspective. But for all intents and purposes, all we need is the 2-point. So I'm going to switch back to that real quick. Here we've got the grid. Some of the other things, yeah, I mean, if you really want to, you can play with a lot of the other anchor points just to decide what you may want to do. You might decide to make a shorter box. You can also make this taller from that same point perspective. These outside actual perspective points, you could click and drag along that horizon line, and you can see how you can start to change the perspective of our said box in this manner. But if you noticed, while I was adjusting, and let me just do Command Z to undo a couple steps, there's this core group that shows basically where all the grid perspective lines are meeting. And as I drag this perspective line here, keep an eye on this grouping down below that's normally very centered and precise. As soon as I pull the left side vanishing point, you notice that middle anchor shifted out from between the other two. Likewise, if I grab this right side, it might bring it back, but I can also start to pull other things a little bit awry. In fact, I could even reverse the space, and now we're more in an interior space. So you can keep kind of futzing you see all day long with what kind of perspective lines you want to offer in this space. Know this: when we start drawing shapes on these perspective walls, the shapes do not necessarily have to be within the grid zone. They will still respond to the perspective. So even when we're playing around like this, once we finally get our grid walls in alignment where we want them to be, then we're ready to go ahead and start drawing. But if you feel like, oh no, I've messed all this stuff up, how do I get it back? The easiest thing to do, real quick, go back up to View, go to Perspective Grid. Ideally, I would love that it would just have a reset perspective, but it doesn't. But what I usually do is I'll switch to one of the different point perspectives, in this case the 1-point, which reset that, and then if I switch back one more time to the 2-point, it reset it back as we started. So now everything's clean and totally there. If you want to simultaneously move both vanishing points at the same time, in that same menu, you're getting really used to it now, going under View to Perspective Grid, there's an option called Lock Station Point, which essentially means these station points down here. So now if I grab the right side vanishing point and I click, hold, and drag to move it, notice how the other one on the left moves in tandem with it. They are both expanding at the same rate, giving us a full control that this center axis station point stays put. So you might start to see, if I wanted to show a package where I show the front of the package here and the side of it there, this would be a better perspective to work with. Vis-a-vis, maybe you want it to go the other direction where I want this to be the front of the panel of the box and then this to be the side. So you've got some wiggle room to play. And again, I'm just going to relatively proportion these back to the middle. I'm not going to worry about resetting this time. But I've got my pieces in place. And this is all still using that same perspective grid tool that's over here on the tool menu. Alright, so now let's get to some drawing. Oh, one other quick thing before we jump to the drawing, my bad. When you have the perspective grid turned on like this, when we can see it on screen, it never prints. This is just for your reference on screen. If you try to print out this grid, it isn't going to show up. Only the artwork on it shows up. But when the grid is active, you can't see it right now because my tool and palette positioning is covering it. But if I move my toolbox down a little bit out of the way, you'll notice that there's this little widget that's shown up in the corner. And this is the planar widget. If it's not showing up on your screen right now, go back to the perspective grid tool, double click on it, and you'll see a little pop-up menu like this. The active plane widget is what this thing is called. If it's not selected and I click OK, you notice it disappeared. But if you need it to show up, double click on the perspective grid tool and click on show the widget, click OK, boom, there it is. What this is telling us is if I draw right now with any rectangles or whatnot, I'm drawing on the blue plane, which is why that one's highlighted. I can click on the bottom triangle. Now it would say if I'm drawing anything, it's going to show up on the green plane, the bottom. And then, all right, of course, if I click on that upper right one, it's orange to click on that one. So basically this widget's helping you understand that which side are we drawing on. There is a final fourth option where if you click on the circle surrounding this little 3D cube, it turns teal, kind of this bluish teal. That means if I draw anything right now, none of it's going to attach to any side of this grid. It's just drawing on the artboard, like you normally would in Illustrator. But, so in this instance, I'm going to click on the blue, and truth of the matter, there are some quick keys for this widget. If I hit the 1 key on the keyboard, it's blue. If I hit the 2 key, it switches to green. If I hit the number 3, it switches to orange. And if I hit the number 4, it draws on that background where it's not the perspective grid. So you can use the numeral quick keys on your keyboard, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you see how that little widget keeps changing color, to quickly switch from side to side if you want to. So I'm going to click on number 1 to get back on the blue side. I'm ready to draw. Last but certainly not least of importance with these tools, in that same area where the perspective grid tool is, if I click and hold on that, there's another actual tool hidden within it called the perspective selection tool. And I'm actually going to use the little toolbar at the end of this menu to go ahead and pop it all the way out. I want this to be there right in the way. The reason why I say this is this other tool, the perspective selection tool, which I'll go ahead and click on, and you notice when I clicked on that, all of my anchors went away and I can't select anything of the grid. And that's fine. We shouldn't be able to. This perspective selection tool now becomes your new arrow, your best friend. Because if we move any shapes or anything around on this perspective grid on any of the 3 sides, if I don't use this tool to move it, the changes won't happen perspective-wise. If I accidentally switch back to your main selection tool, that black arrow, or the direct selection tool, the white arrow, if I use either of those arrows to move the artwork will literally pop off the perspective grid. And I'll show you more in a second. But that's why I tend to take this little tool group, and I'll show you again if I close it, go back to that perspective grid tool, show its pop-up menu, and go all the way to the end to hit that little bar to pop it out, and its own little palette. I always tend to put that up here in the way to remind myself not to go all the way back to these arrows, because old habits die hard. So, this is my new arrow tool in the perspective grid all the time. Savvy? Okay, so let's draw a little bit. So even if I go ahead and grab a rectangle tool, and let me change color a little bit so it really stands out. We'll just pick a super vibrant red. I'll leave a black outline on it. I think that's fine. I've got my number 1 side selected in the little widget, which means any rectangles I draw right now are going to appear on the blue side. So let's draw a rectangle. Ooh, so you see as I'm clicking and dragging the rectangle on the trackpad or mouse, it drew a rectangle, and it's in total perspective, right in line with this blue side. And see, it's not all positioned on top of the actual blue grid. I'll zoom in a little bit here. But it still keeps everything in perspective. The computer is acknowledging this is on a perspective. So again, now if I click on my perspective selection tool, this little arrow guy, I can do anything like I've been doing in the regular drawing. If I hold down the Option key, you'll notice it changes into a duplicating arrow, so I can drag a copy of this other rectangle, and you notice the copy changes in perspective. If I hold down that Option key and the Shift key, just like before, it keeps it on a parallel path or a vertical path from the original object, or even a 45-degree. So I can kind of keep playing, but you notice it keeps it all in perspective every time. So you can see I can start to drag several windows, and just like that other technique I showed you, as soon as I do this once, I let go of both trackpad, mouse, and keyboard, everything. And if I just hit Command D, I can keep duplicating these mighty red door windows all the way down the path. Again, if I want to move these rectangles right now, I still need to use that perspective selection tool. Don't go back to the arrows, the black or white arrows, leave them alone. I can drag a selection across the group and move them up and down all along this whole path. And they're going to stay in perspective. Whoa, pretty freaky, right? And same thing, I might drag, Option Shift, drag a second copy of these down below. So you start to see how you could create a building pretty quickly on a lot of this. Now you might not know for certain what actual angles you want your perspective grid to be at first. So oftentimes it's good to just rough stuff in, but then if you decide that, oh, I'd rather see more of this side of the building than the other, you would pretty much have to scrap all this artwork, go back and adjust your grid like we were using with the actual perspective grid tool, and then start to redraw again. So, but this will be really easy for packaging, and I'll show you how in a second. So, vice versa. We've been drawing here, dragging Option to select, and pulling things all along that whole perspective. What's our next thing? So, let me see if I can show you this other trick. If I happen to select and drag a rectangle with Option and Shift, but I tap the number 3 key while I'm holding down all these buttons, you'll notice the rectangle switched to the orange side. And how did I do that again? I'll show you one more time. Undid that. So I've got to, again, with my perspective selection tool, don't be going back to that black or white arrows, leave those alone. I put the mouse over the rectangle, hold down the Option key to duplicate it, hold down the Shift key to keep it on a perfect parallel. And while I'm starting to drag a copy, while holding down trackpad and mouse, or mouse, whichever, remember those numeral keys I told you for switching sides on the grid? 1, 2, 3, and 4, although 4 is not on the grid. 1 is the blue side, 2 is the green side, 3 is the orange. If I want to switch this rectangle to the orange side of the grid, I can tap the number 3 key once, and you notice it put that rectangle right over here, and then I can let go of the mouse, and then let go of the Shift and Option keys, and boom, it switched sides. What? Yeah, it did. So yeah, and I'm going to change its color real quick so we see that. And then again, now you see the widget has changed color. I'm on the orange number 3 side. I can drag, Shift, Option, more windows and whatnot over here. And yeah, so you can see how drawing on this perspective grid can be a whole lot of fun actually. It's just a different means of creating stuff. I can even go ahead and draw a couple on the bottom, the green side, which I'll tap into there. Draw a couple squares, look at that. And just so you know, what I did right there, yeah, I'm on the green wedge side of the widget. Say that 3 times fast. And then I drew this rectangle down there. I'll change its color a little bit too. This is where Illustrator gets a little less 3D. So of course I drew this rectangle after the others, so it's drawing them in front of that. You still have the option, like when you're drawing in normal Illustrator mode, of sending objects to front and back, because all of these are still on the same layer. We're still only on one layer here. So while I've got this selected, I can always go to Object, Arrange, Send to Back, or Command-Shift left bracket if you want those quick keys. And now you see how the flooring went behind the windows that we made earlier. So you still have that aspect within this 3D mode. Alright, so that being said, oh yeah, and there is one other last little crazy dimension thing. Oops. Oh yeah, here's that example of what I was showing you. By default, here I went back to that black arrow for the direct selection. Here's where if I click this rectangle and pull it, notice it doesn't change perspective. It stayed its final shape and now it's no longer on the grid. Even if I switch back to my perspective tool, it's not going to let me fix it. It's too late. I have to at least undo to make sure it's there. And now if I click on that, it goes back to perspective. So that's why I keep saying pop this little tool wedge out, keep it out towards the front, and kind of tell it in a visual way to block you from going back to the other arrows, because this is your new arrow, your new best friend. There's actually secretly a 4th dimension, if I can remember this. Instead of actually traveling flush against the wall of the the side that we're working on, in this case the blue side of the wedge. If I actually go ahead and, let me zoom back just a little bit. No, not too far. Whoa, hey, Illustrator, slow down. Here we go. So I can actually extrude things away from the wall while still working on this plane. And if I remember right, it's Option Shift 5. Yep. So if you notice when I start to pull this main red rectangle up in the screen, there's a little center axis line right here that's aligning to the original. So as I'm clicking and holding and dragging with the mouse or your trackpad, I'm holding down the Option key, the Shift key, and the number 5 key, the mysterious one that's not listed anywhere else. And that allows me to keep dragging out away from the wall. And you can see it starts to create this really weird perspective because it's zooming right along and then mirror imaging on itself. So if I zoom back a little bit, you start to see how this original board is zipping away. Here that we're over this vanishing point, that's why it suddenly gets so slim. And now we're seeing the back side of the red rectangle as it goes along. So you can always play with that too. Whoa, fourth dimension. But that was achieved, remember, only using, again, my direct perspective selection tool and the number 5 key. So clicking on that, hold down Option to duplicate, hold down Shift to keep it parallel, and hold down the number 5 key to drag it out with the mouse. Let go of the mouse, click and drag one more, let go of the mouse, click and drag another, let go of the mouse, click and drag another, so thin, let go of the mouse, and you can keep dragging more and more out all day long. So you can see it can get pretty trippy working on this perspective grid if you want it to. Alright, I know, but now you're like, okay, Short, that's great. What else you got? We were here to talk about packaging or bag design. Okay, so here's the quick and easy way to play with all this stuff. Alright, so for the minute, I'm just going to delete everything off here. I know this is a box that I want to make, so what I'm going to do is actually change up my perspective a little bit on this grid by going back to my perspective grid tool. I've got the sides locked still, so when I shift over the blue, the orange is going to respond accordingly to keep that center anchor point locked in place. Now I can switch back to here. So, okay, I've got some infamous support artwork going on. Let's see here. This summer materials assignments. Where's that support? Oh, right, demos. All right, so I got some demo pieces. I've got this handy dandy file. Hey, it's called box sizes. Yes, wait for it. There's the bad joke. Felicity. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's an old TV show. It's a bad joke. So, what this is in this file, you're going to notice that we actually have 2 artboard files. This is my side of the box, and this is the front of the box. Nice little simple T product. And yes, for those that asked, what I would always recommend first is converting everything to outlines, which you can do a Command-A to select all, Command-Shift-O for outlines. Most everything's already outlines to begin with, but it's just part of the process. This only works best if you convert type legible things that are editable into outlines. What you'll also notice about this box file is that both artboards are the exact same size. If you want this to work well and effortlessly, create everything at the actual size relationship-wise. So I'm saying I wouldn't want to create the side of the box at a smaller height than the front of the box, especially if there's more artwork on it, obviously. But when you do the scale and the perspective grid in the other file, that's where that would cause issues. So create the flat sides as you would. At this point, I would drag the regular arrow, because I'm in this file, over everything on the side box and group it. Command-G, or object group right there. I guess I'll ungroup real quick so you can see it highlighted. Select both, object, group, Command-G. Group the pieces first. Now let's copy, switch back to our other file with the grid, and let's paste. So of course it's pasting flat. That's how it was created. but I want to switch this to the blue side of the grid. So I can switch to my perspective selection tool. I know that the blue wedge is actually highlighted here, and the minute I click and move, boom, it totally put it on the perspective. And the nice thing is it tends to lock into anchor points on the grid, so it's very easy for me to move the whole entire grouped artwork and have it snap to the grid. And in this instance, I'll probably start to see that I might need a slightly higher vanishing point, but that's going to be easy to do, because if I don't like how it ended up perspective-wise, I can just delete the artwork off here, adjust the grid, go back to my original file, and recopy and paste the artwork. So, that being said, we've got the left side of the box in place. Boom, it's done. It's in perspective. Its edge is right up on that edge of the grid where I want it to be. Likewise, now I go back to the file, to the other artboard, and just like I mentioned, select it all. And what do we do first? Group it. Not like group on, but group it. Command G. It's all grouped together as one unit. Now Command C for copy. Or if you need to go back to file, or not file, edit and copy here, you can do that. But Command C is the quick key version of it. I'll swap over to that other file. This time I paste again. But don't touch it and move it, because right now I'm still locked into that blue side of the grid. So don't move it right away. Make sure you click on the orange side of the wedge up here. And now again, still with that perspective selection tool, because this won't work with the black and white arrows. No, no, no. Yeah, sing it out. And then immediately now when I start to move it, boom, it's put it in perspective right away. And again, I can use the quick zoom in to make sure I'm hitting the grid right where I want it. Get it to line up. And huzzah, boom. Felicity, the box. And of course, we're used to Command-I for proofreading or spell checking in Adobe products, but for this perspective grid, it's Command+Shift+, then the I key to toggle the perspective grid on and off. You can keep toggling back and forth by holding down Command-Shift, and every time you hit the I key, it turns that perspective grid on or off. We got it turned off for now. And look at that, it's a box. How about that? Perspective and everything. Granted, it's a little sharper of a distortion on this top than I would like, so reality is, yeah, I would probably simply delete these, go back to my perspective tool, and probably raise up the bar on the vanishing point line just a little bit. Remember those anchor points out here on the outside, top side? That helps adjust the angle. So it's a little less steep up above, maybe a little steeper where the bottom of the box would be. Switch back to normal tools, and yeah, just redo it all again. I can copy paste back from the original file. It's here, the orange side is selected, I've got my perspective selection tool, swapping it back, and starting the process all over again. But it's very easy to do to keep adjusting when you only have to copy paste. And I can Command-Shift+I to look at it. That's a little better. But yeah, I still might adjust it, but that's just me. So, now you know. That's the easy way to create and work with the perspective grid. Not too hard, but it just takes a little bit of time to adjust to knowing that you're drawing on perspective, and to always use the perspective grid tools, not those pesky arrows at the start. No black or white arrows. Only the new perspective selection arrow, this guy. So it's an arrow with the little 3D cube wedge, widget, whatever you want to call it, attached to it. So that's your new best friend for this whole thing. And you could maybe create a whole shelf of Felicity. You can tell there's going to be some scaling issues depending on how detailed your artwork is, but you could get pretty crazy with some stuff. Yeah, it does not like that to scale too much. So, but this is a nice, quick, easy way to create some packaging very effortlessly. And again, I'll run back over here. Everything is still grouped, so I can just copy. And I'll paste. Switch to the blue side of the wedge up here. Whoop. Make sure it's my perspective selection tool. Switch to the blue. Boom. Packaging achieved. Life is good. Hello, package. So, welcome to it. 3D Perspective Grid. Your friend, not your enemy. So good luck out there, and I will see you all next class. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.